Good evening, Rowan. It's the 12th of August 2016 and it's about 9 o'clock. And obviously, I'm making you my usual Friday evening video to reassure you I won't be seducing any priests over the weekend, so you can relax. Anyway, I thought we could carry on having our little chat about your inherent lunacy, really. And the aspect of that I want to focus on this evening is that you don't seem to have the same grasp of metaphor and abstract thinking that the majority of adults do, and particularly someone with your level of education. So, I'm going to just speak briefly about an assessment tool that was used where I worked last, which part of my job was assessing uh, people to see if they were experiencing first episode psychosis or not, and that was the group of people that I was supporting. And one of the assessment tools that we used in that place, I wasn't a big fan of it actually, but I am familiar with it, is known as the positive and negative syndrome scale. And this is a psychological tool of assessment. It's not, it wasn't devised by psychiatry. It's a very lengthy process, and you can actually download the assessment form off the internet, but you have to pay £319. So I haven't done that, but I did download the scoring sheet so that I can show the aspect of unusual thinking that I'm talking about in relation to you, this kind of confusion, really, around the use of metaphor and around abstract thinking. I mean, one example of that would be that you don't seem to understand that society is made up of individuals. You think that society is a concrete entity in itself, whereas in fact it's only an abstract, a collection of individuals. And you don't seem to understand that societies don't have qualities. It's only the individuals within the society that have those qualities and would drive the direction in which the society is going. You seem to have some confusion around that. So that's one example of what seems to be a difficulty with abstract thinking um, in relation to you. So, I'm going to illustrate this further, I'm going to refer to two videos. I'm going to show these video clips and I'm going to talk about the things that you say in these video clips that gives me the impression that you don't really understand metaphor in the same way that other people do. Now, this assessment tool, the positive and negative syndrome scale, is used for assessing people to see if they're experiencing psychosis or not and to what degree. It would be used with people who psychiatrists would generally label as having schizophrenia, which is a fictitious illness, but I won't go into that now. But I'm not saying that I think you have a psychosis. I think that the difficulties that you experience are rooted in your personality. A psychosis is a transient thing, really. You could say a response to extreme stress of one kind or another, whereas your confusion about ordinary life, shall we say, seems to be rooted in your personality. And I think it's because you're actually chronically immature as a person. You don't seem to have grasped things that even small children you would expect them to grasp, like by the age of 7 or 5 in some cases. Your emotional and psychological development seems below that. Now, you can download this assessment tool from the internet, but it costs £319 to do that. So I haven't downloaded it. I have downloaded the score sheet, which just gives a little indication of what I'm talking about. You can download that for free. But I am familiar with this assessment tool. As I said, it was used where I worked before, and I have taken part in using this assessment tool on clients of our service, some of them. And so I'm familiar with the questions on it. And so I'm talking now about a difficulty with abstract thinking, and the way this is assessed on this positive and negative syndrome scale is to tell the person who you're assessing some proverbs, some quite common proverbs, and see if the person understands what the proverb means. And this, by this, you're able to assess to some degree how competent they are at abstract thinking in that moment, that they're not taking everything in a very concrete and literal way. I can't actually remember what these proverbs are just now, but I'm going to give another example of what I mean by abstract thinking. So, if you say to someone, I'm racing against the clock, then that person would understand that you meant you didn't have much time to finish the tasks that you needed to do before you had to move on to something else, or that you were trying to do something as fast as possible. That's what it would mean if you said you were racing against the clock. Someone who couldn't think in an abstract way, either because they were experiencing some disturbance in the normal cognitive functioning, or a small child wouldn't be able to understand that in an abstract way either, and realise that you're speaking metaphorically, you're not really and literally racing against the clock. A small child would think that you were literally racing against a clock. So that's what I mean by difficulty in abstract thinking, and the fact that you don't seem to understand metaphor, which gives rise to you saying some things that are really quite bewildering to someone who has a more mainstream way of thinking about things. And I think this is because you're chronically immature. So it's not because of some kind of unusual disturbance in your normal cognitive functioning. You're like this all of the time. It does come out more when you're under stress, but I think it's a feature of your personality, and the fact is that you're chronically immature and you're not really engaging with reality as it is. You're trying to impose your version of reality, which is in fact a fantasy that's in your head, on the world as you experience it and the other people in it. So I'm going to now move on to talk about a couple of things you said in a couple of videos. The first video is the TED talk that you gave in May this year, where you were talking about novels and novelists, and I've already made a video about this, saying how you seem to think that you're the novelist and all the other people that you encounter are characters in your novel. So I've made that video already, but I'm now going to just quote from a short part of it to show what I think is a difficulty that you have in understanding metaphor. And this means that you don't really grasp the meaning of other people when they speak in a metaphorical way. So here's what you say. We know that the storyteller knows more than the character in the story can ever know. We know that there's irony shot through every novel. The storyteller may say, as some great novelists have said of their characters, that they're surprised by what the characters do. Tolstoy famously said that he was astonished when Anna Karenina decided to commit suicide. But we know actually they are in control. And if, at the end of that enormous book, Tolstoy had decided that Anna Karenina should live happily ever after, he could have done it, and Anna Karenina wouldn't be in any position to object. So you've expressed this in quite an unusual way, and I think not just on the basis of this, but on things that you've said over and over again over the years, and I'm going to give another example in a minute, that you don't understand exactly how Tolstoy was using this metaphor. So you say that Tolstoy famously said that he was astonished when Anna Karenina decided to commit suicide. Now, to a person who understands metaphor, that would mean that when Tolstoy started reading the book, he had a vague idea about where it was going to go and how it was going to end, and he hadn't planned that Anna Karenina was going to commit suicide, so he was surprised when it turned out that way. So, what Tolstoy is really saying is when he started to write the novel, he didn't know how it was going to end, and it went in a different direction to what he thought it would originally. So he's not relating to Anna Karenina as a real person, as you seem to almost think she is. It's hard to decide how much you can distinguish between fact and fiction. And I don't think you can really distinguish at all. And this is one example of that, which I've spoken about before, but you don't seem to understand the metaphor that Tolstoy is using. So that's one example I'm giving of your difficulty with abstract thinking, and I'm going to give another one in a minute.
But of course, a novel isn't just somebody else telling a story, let alone telling a story about themselves. We know that the storyteller knows more than the character in the story can ever know. We know that there's irony shot through every novel. The storyteller may say, as some great novelists have said of their characters, that they're surprised by what the characters do. Tolstoy famously said he was astonished when Anna Karenina decided to commit suicide. But we know, actually, they are in control. And if at the end of that enormous book Tolstoy had decided that Anna Karenina should live happily ever after, he could have done it, and Anna Karenina wouldn't be in any position to object.
So my next example comes from the same question and answer session that I already commented on at the beginning of the week, the one where you gave an example of something from the film When Harry Met Sally. But I won't go over that again. Anyway, so later on in the question and answer session, in fact, it's the last question, and I just want to set the scene of this question. Someone prior to this question asked you about the speech that you gave about Sharia law, which many people thought was controversial. And the gist of the question was something along the lines of you suggested Sharia law should be incorporated into UK law, and isn't it really your job to be promoting Christian values in Britain? That's the gist of the question. I mean, I've paraphrased it quite badly. But anyway, you very with kind of condescending patience, you tell the person who asked this question that they didn't understand the talk that you gave about Sharia law, and you've already explained it a lot of times, but you're going to have to go over it all again. So you then go on to give some explanation of this talk you gave about Sharia law. And you're quite annoyed about this question. And in fact, you give this explanation of what you said that you said in this lecture about Sharia law, and then you don't answer the second part of the question, which is, isn't it really your job to be promoting Christian values in Britain? You ignore that part of the question totally, and then you move on. And the next question is about Richard Dawkins and new atheism. So the question itself isn't particularly relevant for the comments I'm about to make, so I haven't included it. And the other two panelists already answer this question before you come on to talk about it. So you're the third person to speak in response to this question. And this is what you say. My own worry about the Dawkins approach, and I think it's very interesting that you generalise it from religion more widely, and you say quite rightly. One of the things that worries me is the idea this is the only explanation. This is the only explanation. You repeat that. So I suppose you're talking about how Richard Dawkins explains the existence of life and diversity of creatures and all this kind of thing. So you then go on to say, now, I think in the real world, that's quite funny actually, hearing you talking about the real world. Now, I think in the real world, we use different kinds of explanation in different areas. Why is this happening? There may be 6 equally good answers to that. Richard Dawkins is, I think, in danger of saying there is just one basic answer, and it's genetics. It's biogenetics. That's it. I'm not even sure that biogenetics is a thing. I mean, all genetics is kind of bio, isn't it? It relates to living creatures. There aren't any other kinds of genetics, really. And then you say, and having said that, he then introduces this curious idea that somewhere inside us there are lots of little blokes called genes. Now you're going on really to refer to a book that Richard Dawkins wrote in the 70s, which has the title The Selfish Gene. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute. But this is what you're saying. He has a very reductive view of the existence of everything and human existence. This is what you're saying, and this is what the other panelists have said prior to this, and then this is what you go on to say about it. And having said that, he then introduces this curious idea that somewhere inside us there are lots of little blokes called genes. They've all got purposes and ideas and aims, and their aims are selfish and competitive. So I haven't read this book, but I would look at a title like that and understand instinctively that it was a metaphor, the selfish gene, because a gene is only a collection of large molecules, really, and so it can't behave in a sentient way, so it wouldn't be selfish. We wouldn't even describe other animals as being selfish either. Selfishness is an exclusively human quality. So to get hysterical about this and not recognise the metaphorical nature of the title is quite staggering. And I'm not saying hysterical. I'm going to play the clip, and you do become quite unhinged when you're talking about this, which has just come after a question about Sharia law that did upset you a little bit as well. But this idea is obviously really upsetting for you, and you become quite unhinged. And my opinion about the reason for that, I mean, apart from the fact that you're not understanding it as metaphorical, the selfish gene, is that you can't tolerate any form of criticism or narcissistic injury. So the fact that you don't understand that this is a metaphor, you think that Richard Dawkins is literally saying that you're selfish in your nature, in your identity, in your whole being, because it's there in your genes. That's what you think is saying because you don't understand the metaphor. And this is why you're so terribly affronted, in my opinion, for these two reasons. You don't understand metaphor, and therefore you can't tolerate this implicit criticism in the title, The Selfish Gene, and the idea that there might be anything in your makeup that is selfish. So I'm going to go on and quote what you said now. So you say that he introduces this curious idea that somewhere inside us there are lots of little blokes called genes. They've all got purposes and ideas and aims, and their aims are selfish and competitive. It's a jungle in there, and you're pointing down at yourself when you say that. And then you say, but you know, there are no little blokes inside us. And then very emphatically you state, there is no such thing as a gene. And then you repeat that, there is no such thing as a gene. So I'm now just going to read a definition of a gene from biology.com. And I would say that this understanding of a gene, I have actually got an A level in biology, and this is sub A level knowledge. Really, you would expect to know more about genes and the way they operate in cells for A level biology, at least when I took an A level, that was the case, which was in the 1980s. So here's a gene definition from biologyabout.com. Genes are segments of DNA located on chromosomes that contain the instructions for protein production. Genes exist in more than one form. These alternative forms are called alleles, and there are typically two alleles for a given trait. Alleles determine distinct traits that can be passed on from parents to offspring. Um, so that's the definition of a gene. You say there is no such thing as a gene. You've actually got no idea what a gene is because you've never studied anything useful at all. And even when you study theology, which Richard Dawkins wouldn't consider useful, really. I mean, it's useful if you're going to um, be a clergy person or something, or if you're going to teach religious studies, or if you're going to be a lecturer in theology, or if you're going to out you as an Illuminati shill, then theology is very useful for those things, but it doesn't have the same kind of practical material application that the study of biology does. So you don't even understand concrete definitions in your own field, so you wouldn't really understand, I don't think, that there's actually a definition of what a gene is. So you then go on to say, after saying there's no such thing as a gene is a convenient word that we use for certain clusters of behaviour and interaction among in the midst of our genetic material. But there aren't any little things there. And what amazes me is the way in which people buy so easily into this profoundly, you emphasise that, mythological view of what's going on. So many people, including me, think Darwinism is mythological or a religious belief because there isn't any scientific evidence for it. It's only an opinion. So it is mythological and it's presented as if it were fact, when in fact it's only a theory. It hasn't been proved, and a lot of the evidence that there is tends to contradict it. But that's a huge topic, so I won't go into that now. But you're not talking about that because you don't actually believe in creation, do you? You've said that emphatically, and I've illustrated that before by showing a clip of a video where you said that people who believe the creation story in the book of Genesis are misreading it, and you say that they're reading it in the wrong way. It's not intended to prove anything factual about what happened. And then you lump intelligent design in with creationism because you apparently don't understand the difference between those two things. But in fact, intelligent design is a scientific theory and isn't related to any religious text. So you don't believe in creation. So when you're criticising Richard Dawkins as introducing profoundly mythological ideas, you actually believe in evolution anyway. So it's quite hard to understand um, in just a general way why you would be so upset about what he's saying, apart from the fact that you don't understand metaphor, and you think that he's literally saying that you've got selfish things inside you that are determining everything, and this means that there's something defective in you because selfishness is bad. So if the gene is selfish and you don't understand that as a metaphor, then this means that you're bad or there's some flaw in you, and you've got to understand yourself as perfect in every way. And this is my view of why you've got so hysterical about this. And I'm going to play the clip, I'm not exaggerating. So you say, he introduces this profoundly mythological view of what's going on. There's a little bloke in there, and he's selfish. He's not very nice. Get a lot of them together in one place like a human being, and it's no surprise if human beings aren't always very nice. Um, you are quite unhinged when you're saying all of these things. But I would point out, as I've already said, selfishness is a purely human characteristic, yet every other living being has genes, has genetic material. So it's quite obvious that selfishness isn't meant literally, even um, just by virtue of that fact. You don't really need to understand metaphor very deeply to understand that. So you go on to say, well, give me strength, you know, and you put your hands up to your head then. That really is not how scientific analysis ought to be working. Suddenly importing melodrama about nasty little blokes running around inside. You see, this is what I mean. You don't understand metaphor. And you weren't able to keep a lid on all of this because prior to this question, you've been previously upset by this question about Sharia law, where you were having to justify yourself again. And then you didn't answer half of the question, and you've moved on to this, and I think, you know, someone had already pushed your buttons, and now this is pushing your buttons even more. So someone criticised you just before this, and you can't tolerate criticism, and now Richard Dawkins is implicitly criticising you again because you don't understand metaphor, and this is why you've become so unhinged, in my view. So you then say, so I'd want to push back a bit on the mythology that people like Richard Dawkins work with and say the human world is one in which we quite rightly use lots of explanations, lots of frames of interpretation. There's no one to which everything else can be reduced into which everything goes. So your question is absolutely right. Take Dawkins seriously, and a great deal about routine human trust, love, and imagination goes down the tubes as well. So, in relation to you, you talk here about routine human trust, love, and imagination. I mean, the ironic thing about this is that you are an exceptionally selfish person. You're predatory. You do everything you can to eliminate competitors. Look what you've done to me, and I'm not the only person. You're promoting competent people because you can't stand competition. So really, having any routine human trust, love, and imagination, I don't know what that's got to do with anything anyway. A great deal about routine human trust and love. It's not a good idea to have it in relation to you, is it? Because you're not trustworthy, you're predatory, and you've got a psychopathic drive for controlling people and exterminating or eliminating anyone who gets in your way. So whether we take Richard Dawkins seriously or not, it's still not a good idea to be engaging in routine human trust and love in relation to you. Not in the kind of woozy sense, I mean. Anyway, I mean in the sense of trusting you and thinking that you're a loving person, because it quite simply isn't true. Anyway, after this outburst, you suddenly say, "I'm sorry, we're over time," so you cut everything short just after that. Well, you may have been over time, but you couldn't wait to get out of that question and answer session. For having so many people pushing your buttons, and they're only 16 to 18-year-olds. So, how do you cope with older adults, people who can be more robust, which is a favourite word that you use when you're not being robust at all, in fact? But how do you cope with more mature adults who've got more experience and who are probably more likely to stand up to you in many cases? So you couldn't even cope with some teenagers. And you do become quite unhinged. So I'll play this clip in a minute, and then obviously I'm going to say a word about my beloved.
My own worry about the Dawkins approach, and I think it's very interesting that you generalize it from religion more widely, quite rightly. One of the things that worries me is the idea, this is the only explanation. This is the only explanation. Now, I think in the real world, we use different kinds of explanation in different areas. Why is this happening? There may be 6 equally good answers to that. Richard Dawkins is in danger, I think, of saying there's just one basic answer, and it's genetics, it's biogenetics. That's it. And having said that, he then introduces this curious idea that somewhere inside us there are lots of little blokes called genes. They've all got purposes and ideas and aims, and their aims are selfish and competitive. It's a jungle in there. But, you know, there are no little blokes inside us. There is no such thing as a gene. There is no such thing as a gene. A gene is a convenient word that we use for certain clusters of behavior and interaction in the midst of our genetic material. But there aren't little things there. And what amazes me is the way in which people buy so easily into this profoundly mythological view of what's going on. The selfish gene gives it away. There's a little bloke in there and he's selfish. He's not very nice. Get a lot of them together in one place like a human being, and it's no surprise if human beings aren't always very nice. Well, give me strength. You know, that really is not how scientific analysis ought to be working. Suddenly importing this melodrama about nasty little blokes running around inside. So I'd want to push back a bit on what I think is the mythology that people like Richard Dawkins work with and say, the human world is one in which we quite rightly use lots of explanations, lots of frames of interpretation. There's no one to which everything else can be reduced in terms of which everything goes. So your question is absolutely right. Take Dawkins seriously, and a great deal about routine human trust, love, and imagination goes down the tubes as well. I'm sorry, we're over time.